Here's a guy who thinks that knowledge is only possible if all concepts are created by God.
When thinking about human knowledge, there are two essential categories. One is the category of factuality, and the other is the category of interpretation. Factuality is the status of being a fact. It is common to define a fact as a state of affairs in which an object possesses a property. For example, an apple may be red. That state of affairs, which is the redness of the apple, is a fact that can be expressed by the proposition, the apple is red. Interpretation, on the other hand, can be defined as the act of identifying an object as something. For example, when you see a chair and identify it as a chair, as opposed to a mountain, you are interpreting your experience. To be more technical about it, interpretation is the application of individuative concepts to an object of experience. In any instance of knowledge, fact and interpretation of fact come together. To know that there is a green car outside, the state of affairs expressed by that proposition must actually be instantiated.
Well, what do you mean by actually instantiated? I will accept the truth of the assertion there is a green car outside if I go outside and I see an object that looks to me like a car, that looks to me like it's green, and if that experience is more consistent than a dream or hallucination. In other words, the truth of that proposition is wholly contingent upon its consistency with my observation and the interpretation of that observation.
And I must be able to identify that object as a car. Now we could ask the question, which of these categories, factuality or interpretation, is more fundamental?
Well, I would say that factuality is more fundamental, because in order to have an experience which I interpret as being an experience of a green car, I must first collect sense data. I have to see color, I have to see an object, and only after I see those things can I judge whether the color matches my concept of green and whether the object matches my concept of car. Collecting the sense data comes first, and interpreting those sense data comes second.
In other words, is factuality ultimately logically prior to interpretation, or is interpretation ultimately logically prior to factuality? Atheism's answer to this metaphysical question seems to be the former.
I don't think you have to be an atheist in order to believe it to be the former. Even if there is a God who creates concepts, you have to have a sensory experience before you judge that experience as matching any particular concept.
See, atheism takes for granted the non-createdness of the facts. On atheism, the only agents capable of interpretation are humans, and human minds are not metaphysically ultimate or fundamental by any means.
Oh, I think I see what this dude means now. He thinks that if humans create concepts, then those concepts cannot help us form knowledge because knowledge must be a conformity between concepts and reality. Well, that depends on what you mean by knowledge. I would not define knowledge as ideas which conform to some human mind-independent reality. I think it's pretty obvious that human minds have no infallible access to human mind-independent reality, even if there is a God. Even if there is a God who reveals reality to us, we still have to perceive and interpret those revelations through our fallible human minds. Rather, when I say I know an assertion to be true, all I mean is that my experience is consistent with that assertion. I do not, and as far as I can tell, cannot, mean that such an assertion conforms to any mind-independent reality. I can suspect that it does because that's the simplest interpretation, but I can't be certain.
My interpretation of a fact is not what makes the fact what it is.
Insofar as you use invented concepts, and all concepts are invented, yes, your interpretation of a fact makes that fact what it is. Let's do a little thought experiment. Let's say you are walking down the street and you pass a car crash. Let's say you find a piece of metal on the ground that flew off of one of the cars involved. You look at this piece of metal and you think, that looks just like a butter knife. Now maybe it was part of the hood or the roof or the door of one of the cars, but the crash shaped it in such a way that it resembles a butter knife. Is it then a butter knife? I suspect that most people would say that it is not, but let's say you pick it up, you take it home, you wash it, and you put it in your utensil drawer with your butter knives, and you use it as one. Is it then a butter knife? I think that at that point it is. I honestly can't see why it wouldn't be. I think that you're using the thing as a butter knife, and your regarding of the thing as a butter knife effectively makes it a butter knife. I think the same is true of all concepts. I think ultimately humans decide what empirical observations make a thing a member of one or another concept. I don't don't think there needs to be a God to decide this for us. This dude seems to think that knowledge is only possible if there is some God which defines categories and concepts for us. I have a different idea of what constitutes knowledge. I think we can know that something is a particular thing, even if we humans are the only ones who invent the distinctions between particular things. There is a lot of controversy nowadays about the idea of social constructs. When someone says X is a social construct, there are folks who seem to think that this means X is totally made up BS based on absolutely nothing. That is not what social construct means. Now, there are some social constructs which are totally invented, like institutions, money, etc. Nobody discovered money, for example. It was an invention. However, if I say vertebrates are a social construct, there are folks who misinterpret that as meaning that animals with vertebrae don't really exist. That's not what it means. What it means is that it is human beings that decided that having or not having vertebrae should be the basis for membership or non-membership in a category. Let's say we decided to categorize animals by mass. We put all animals which are less than or equal to 50 kilograms in mass in one category, and all animals greater than 50 kilograms in mass in another category. We could create such a categorical system if we wanted to, and if we did, it would be every bit as objective and empirical as the distinction between vertebrates and invertebrates. We don't sort animals this way because doing so would not be useful to us human beings. The reason we sort vertebrates from invertebrates is because when an animal has vertebrae, there are lots of other features that we can infer it has from that simple fact. There's much less that all animals greater than 50 kilograms in mass have in common, so such a distinction is not as epistemically useful to us human beings. The reason we come up with categorical concepts and sort things into those categories is not because God decides what's what and reveals these concepts to us. The reason we make these categorical distinctions is because doing so is organizationally useful to us as human beings. God has nothing to do with it.
The human mind has no control over factuality. The facts are there, existing independently of our minds, and we come along and try to interpret them. So the atheist, if he isn't some kind of solipsist, must affirm the priority of factuality over interpretation. The problem, however, is that if the category of factuality is ultimately more fundamental than the category of interpretation, then knowledge becomes impossible. Interpretation requires an interpretative schema which possesses the necessary individuative concepts.
No, it doesn't. Much of the process of interpretation, in the sense that this word is used here, is the invention of such concepts. We don't need a God to create them for us.
Without individuative concepts like flower, book, chair, etc., I wouldn't be able to identify an object as something.
Sure, we have to come up with the concept of a flower before we can identify objects that have the properties that we have decided are the properties which define a flower, but we can do that. We can make up these concepts on our own. We don't need a God to do it for us.
My experience would just be of a blank, undifferentiated identity.
No, it wouldn't. Without concepts, we would still have all the same sensory experiences that we have now. For example, we could see different colors before we came up with the names and concepts to represent any particular color. The fact that the color concepts we come up with vary from culture to culture shows that the conceptual distinctions that we draw between colors are, in fact, invented rather than revealed by a god. For example, the reason why we say that people with red hair have red hair when it's clearly orange is because when we started describing people as having red hair, our culture had no concept of orange as a distinct color from red. What we think of today as orange was considered a kind of red prior to about the 1500s.
Furthermore, interpretative schemas introduce relations between individual facts. If an object was so individual in character that it shared nothing in common with any other object, then it would be impossible to identify it as something.
That's not true. If we found an object which bore no commonalities with anything else, we could easily invent a brand new concept and identify it as that. We come up with new concepts all the time, and we don't need God's help to do it.
It is the roundness, the sweetness, the redness of an apple, qualities it has in common with other objects, that allows me to identify it as an apple.
But if apples had a color, shape, and flavor that no other object had, we could still invent a new concept into which we categorized apples.
The conclusion then is that apart from an interpretative schema, Facts are unrelated to one another.
Yeah, but we can invent a schema which relates facts to other facts. And we invent categories and concepts to organize objects with clusters of facts or properties that appear together in order to serve our own purposes. Like the example I gave earlier, if something effectively serves the purpose that a butter knife serves, then even if it wasn't produced in a butter knife factory, it is nonetheless a butter knife.
Now, to know a fact, my interpretation of that fact must correspond to actual state of affairs.
That's true in the sense that in order to accurately identify something with a concept which is defined as having a specific set of properties, that thing has to actually have those properties.
What this entails is that the facts must conform to my interpretative schema.
Rather, your interpretative schema ought to be based around observed facts.
But this cannot happen since my interpretative schema has no influence on the facts.
Yeah, which is why the facts come first, and the concepts have to come second and be based on those facts. This worldview is called existentialism. Its central premise is that existence precedes essence. Another way this is articulated is thatness precedes whatness. To put it simply, stuff first exists, and then humans come along and think up concepts which categorize different clusters of properties and particular things. This idea has a lot in common with social constructivism.
Because factuality precedes interpretation, the facts are what they are independent of any interpretative schema.
Yeah, that's why we observe empirical sense data first, then we make up concepts to organize those data second.
And if this is the case, then the facts are wholly individual and cannot correspond to any interpretative schema.
They can if we design an interpretative schema around those facts.
Hence, if factuality precedes interpretation, the human interpretation of a fact can never correspond to the facts themselves.
It can if we design our interpretation to do so.
And thus knowledge of a fact becomes impossible.
Well, what do you mean by knowledge? If by knowledge you mean a conceptualization of a fact or set of facts which we can be absolutely certain will never need to be revised upon further observation, that may be true. We revise our concepts all the time when we make further observations that we decide are more usefully organized if we conceptualize them differently. That's why Pluto is no longer a planet. We revised the concept of what a planet is. But so what? The fact that our concepts may need perpetual revision in order to maximize their utility in no way shows that a god must therefore exist.
And since atheism entails the priority of factuality over interpretation, it entails that human knowledge is impossible. But human knowledge is possible.
How do you know that?
I know that there is a computer in front of me, that I have two hands, and that the earth revolves around the sun.
How do you know you're not in the Matrix and the computer, the sun, and your hands are not all illusory? I don't believe that to be the case, because I don't think that's the most probable explanation for our experiences, but even though I don't think it's probable, I can't rule it out as a possibility, so I don't know that it isn't the case. And I don't understand how you can know that either.
And if I know these things, atheism must be false.
But how do you know these things? Even if there is a God that creates these concepts and reveals them to us, we still have to correctly collect and understand these revealed concepts with our fallible human minds, which guarantees that we can't be certain of them even if they are given to us by a perfect infallible being.
If Christian theism is true, then there is no problem because ultimately interpretation is more fundamental than factuality.
Why does it have to be Christian theism? Why can't any other variety of theism produce knowledge if knowledge is dependent upon a god?
This is because God interprets all facts, identifying and individuating them, even before they are instantiated in time. It is God's interpretation of a fact that makes the fact what it is.
Why can't a Jewish, Hindu, or Greek god do that?
Hence, the facts conform to God's interpretative schema. And as long as the human interpretative schema mirrors God's interpretative schema, human interpretation will correspond to actual states of affairs.
Well, you seem to think that there can only be one interpretative schema that can correspond to actual states of affairs. I'm not convinced that this is the case. I think Stephen Hawking had it right when he described his own epistemology. He believed in what he called model-dependent realism, which says that there is an objective mind-independent reality, but there are multiple different ways of modeling it which can all be equally accurate depictions. Even if there is a God who has an interpretative schema, the schemas we come up with can both be different and equally factually accurate. Also, I see no reason to care whether our interpretative schemas match reality as long as they consistently predict experience. If everything we experience is an illusion, then my only practical concern is whether I can predict the behavior of the illusion. What goes on outside the illusion is inconsequential to me. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.